So as we get started, I want to know right now, what are the kinds of careers that people are thinking about? And if I can just get some thumbs up from somebody or anything, you can see this, correct? The poll, nobody's responded yet. So when responses start coming in, I just need confirmation that people can actually see this. But so text in what's a career you're thinking about right now. Yes, okay, we can see that. All right. So tenure track positions, faculty. Okay, development industry, faculty still leading. Industry, politics, all right. Medical writer, as in project manager, right? Faculty is still kind of leading. Yeah, so there's some diversity here, right? And this is very common. I think that oftentimes one of those things that does rise to the top as faculty is still the biggest, is that that's often what gets us into this, right? We are trained by faculty. We enjoy education. We like university settings. That's definitely part of it. So industry is rising a little bit more, okay? All right. So good. So one of the reasons that I like asking this question is that when I talk to a lot of trainees, sometimes there's feelings that they're alone in feeling like they don't want to necessarily pursue a tenure track position, or that they want to do something else. And it's nice to see the diversity of things that are out there, partly because it's helpful to know that you're not alone in having curiosity about what kinds of careers are out there. Okay. Policy, clinical, all right, lots of different options here. So what I have noticed throughout my time is that oftentimes when people think about what do they want to do for a career, like we had there, it starts with this tenure track option, right? So you're thinking about either at an R1 institution, or maybe you want to do more teaching, but faculty is at the top of the list. And as people start to go through it and they look at whether it's competitive, or some of the things that you have to do to obtain a tenure track position, like going where the job is available, not necessarily where you want to live, people say, all right, maybe I don't want to do that. So then they start thinking about, well, maybe I'll focus on more of a teaching career, or something like industry research, right? But then when you start to investigate those careers a little bit more, you start to see that teaching careers, yeah, there are a lot of pros to it, but you're making $50,000 a year. They're really still very competitive positions. Same goes for industry, right? Industry positions are just as hard to get as tenure track positions. And so this is like, oh, well, maybe I'll start thinking outside the box. Maybe I want to do something like being a medical science liaison. So for those of you who don't know what that is, an MSL is someone who works for a pharmaceutical company or a medical device company, and it's really a teaching position. So you're helping people who use those products understand how they work, why that science is better, why that medication is better than a different one. After that, things start to break down, right? And then it's like, I don't know, I'm going to do something, okay? The unfortunate thing is that then a lot of people get to that stage where it's like, I don't care, I'll take anything because I'm stuck. And one of our goals here today is to help you avoid getting from the anything to the anything stage, right? So making a plan now as you have time. And this is one of those things we'll talk about. It doesn't matter if you're in a postdoc and you want to wrap things up in 3 months, or if you're third year in a PhD program and you have at least 2 or 3 years left. The amount of time that you have will dictate how aggressively you need to do these things. But we're going to talk about strategies for figuring out what are those options. All right, so observations. This is where we're talking a little bit about those career realities right now. So many of you may have seen this graph. This is a Nature Biotechnology paper a number of years ago now. But what they were doing was they were looking at the number of PhDs awarded versus tenure track positions available. So you can see the blue lines are annual and cumulative PhDs awarded. The orange lines are faculty positions created. And you can see that we're not keeping pace, right? So we're awarding many more PhDs than we are creating faculty positions. So the reality started to become present more and more that this really isn't a sustainable thing. We can't just prepare people to be faculty members, because in 2011, there are about 7 times as many eligible people to hold a faculty position as there were faculty positions created, right? So this is why we've had this conversation about, you know, the PhD crisis. What are we doing? Are we training too many folks? Some data from the NSF that looks at the survey of earned doctorates. So they asked people who are finishing their PhDs, do you have definite post-graduation plans? We're going to focus on the life sciences because that's where most people are. And you can see that in 2016, right, only about 38% of people were going to move into faculty positions. So we're also seeing that shift. But even though we're just recently talking about the crisis or all these other things that PhDs do, what I'd like to point out from this graph is if you look back in 1996, which is well before we talked about what are PhDs doing, you see that only about half of people actually still stayed in academia. And most of them were going on to do a postdoc. And then out of a postdoc, it's only a percentage that would do a faculty position. The reality of the situation is that PhDs have always done other things. We just don't talk about it, right? Because we're trained by people who stayed in the academy. We're trained and we're taught and we're mentored by faculty members. We don't hear about all of their colleagues who didn't stay in the academy and went off and did other things. So it's not a new phenomenon that people who have PhDs do things other than faculty careers, right? So there are a lot of options that are out there, and it's always been the case. What are some of these jobs? So we know about a lot of the jobs in academia, right? So those traditional roles, thinking about tenure track positions, but there are a lot of other things that you can do. For example, a research professor series, right? So this is something that is not tenure track, but does not require teaching or service. If you really just love doing research and you just want to get, you're funding your own positions, but you just want to do research, there are options for you. Staff scientist is another option that we don't talk about. There are funding institutes like the National Cancer Institute that is now creating grants specifically for staff scientists. So there are a lot of people who stay in academia and do research, but realize, you know what, I don't want to be the PI. I don't want to be the one who's responsible for all the funding for the lab. When we start to get outside of academia, that's when things really open up, right? So science education and outreach, there are things that you can do inside university settings, but there are also a lot of things you can do outside of this. So outreach coordinator and director, working at a museum. So Nicole Garneau, I believe is her name, she's the director of some programming at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. So she's somebody who did her PhD and during that time realized she didn't want to stay in academia. And so she went and she works for the museum. There are a lot of opportunities for outreach positions, curriculum development, working on educational materials. So communications. So medical writing was one of those things that popped up on the list, right? So medical writing is a career, as is editing, scientific illustrating, right? There are PhDs that do a lot of different things within the communications sphere. Government and nonprofit, right? So one of the things that we don't talk about oftentimes are government research positions. So a good friend of mine from grad school is actually a senior scientist now at NREL. And he knew that he really loved doing research, but he didn't want to stay in academia. He went and did a postdoc at the National Renewable Energy Lab. And now he's on as a scientist there. And so that career is very similar to what you would do in an academic position, except that you don't have to apply for external grants the same way. Now, when the government shuts down, that puts a little more stress on your research experience. But again, there are a lot of positions that are similar there. Thinking about grants manager or policy analyst, right? Do you really like the nitty-gritty of grantsmanship? Industry research, obviously, we talk about, right? So industry scientists. But an important point to pay attention to is that if you're working for Sharklet Technologies across the street at Anschutz, or you're working for Pfizer, that's going to be a very different industry position. So even within something like industry, there are a lot of different opportunities. Some of these can be focused on development or the scientific aspect. Some people start to get interested in the business side of things. Business commercialization and development, right? So this is where medical science liaison shows up, but there are also things like entrepreneurship or working in product development, right? Being a consultant. So consulting is a huge field. Consulting is one of those areas that gives you a lot of opportunities. If you like investigating science and you like communicating, this is a great opportunity because you have an opportunity to help people problem solve. consulting is a growing field. And those, the same ways, you can work for really big firms or you can work for really small firms. Law, policy, and regulatory affairs, right? So intellectual property, or something like our tech transfer office, right? So at CU Innovations, there are actually 3 or 4 different PhDs on their staff. Some of them work for programming. They oversee things like the Spark program. Other people are doing venture analysis, right? So they're looking at the science of the ideas that our academic researchers have and saying, is this something that we could actually take to market? And then medicine and healthcare, clinical trials coordinator. There are opportunities for people to work at hospitals. So former postdocs now work at Children's Hospital, coordinating clinical trials. So again, there's no shortage of the opportunity of careers that are out there for you. My experience as a PhD and as a postdoc was that this was always really intimidating. I felt envious of MDs, because you get your MD and then you do residency and then you're a pediatrician or you're a neurologist or whatever it is, right? But it's defined. And you get your PhD and then you do a postdoc and people say, well, what do you want to do? And then you look at this list of things and it feels like trying to drink from a fire hose. How do I know? I'm totally overwhelmed. And then I don't even know how to start, right? So there are a lot of different opportunities out there. How do you then move into the place of understanding, here's some things that I might be interested in? Okay, so everybody had some idea of their careers, right? So you had some idea of something you want to do. I want to know right now, how confident do you feel in that career choice? Okay, some level of confidence. That's the big word. I'm glad I didn't orient that differently. I'd be being flipped off right now. It's good. Okay, so some level of confidence we have. That's good to know. All right, and that's where it should be, right? You have some idea. Here's something that I'm thinking about, but is that really the thing that you want to do? So how do you know? How do you know it's the right choice? One of the things that I want to address right now is this idea that there is a right choice, right? Because the myth is that there's one career for you. And this is one of those things, hearkening back to what I had just said, we get these messages that you're supposed to do something. You're supposed to do a thing, right? The same way that that resident is prepared to be that pediatrician. We say that you're being prepared to be a faculty member, right? And the idea is that you're going to do this thing for your career. At the end of that time, you know, you're going to get your gold watch and you're going to retire. The reality of the situation is that there are many careers that you could enjoy, right? And when you start to get in touch with what you actually like doing rather than what the position is, you start to see that those show up in different places. So oftentimes, and this was true for myself, but when I talk to people, they're thinking about teaching careers. That's one of the things about academia that they enjoy, right? Whether that's mentoring colleagues or it's formal instruction in the classroom. And so they know that they like teaching. They like that process. But when you start to step back and look at, well, what are the careers that allow you to do teaching? You start to recognize that it's more than just being a university instructor, right? The MSL career that I talked about, that's a teaching position. Your job there is to explain to people why this thing is better than something else. Consulting is a teaching career, right? You have this problem you have to solve, and then for that client, you have to explain to them, why is this the better choice? Why is this the right solution to that problem? Academic administration, which we didn't even really talk about before, a career like mine. There's a lot of teaching that's involved in that, program development, right? So when you step back and you recognize the activities that you enjoy doing, here's the responsibilities, here's the stuff that I really get joy out of. Now you can start to see where those show up in a lot of different careers. So I want to address this, dispel this notion a little bit that there's one thing that's right for you. Okay, so we're going to take a little minute, just a brief little second here. Everybody was asked to bring some job postings with them. So I want you to look at some of those job postings. We're going to just take 5 minutes here. And the worksheet has this exercise, which is to go through those job postings and identify what are some of the skills and qualifications that appealed to you. And I want you to compare at least a couple of those. So go through, highlight them, underline them, whatever you need to do. And then on the worksheet, make that list. For the first job posting, here's what jumped out at me. Here's what I like about that. And then I want you to create a little master list that says across those different positions, here were some of those skills that I enjoy. So we're going to take a little bit of time to do this. And then we'll come back and we'll have a little conversation. But this is one of those activities that becomes part of the homework too, is getting comfortable with that. But let's spend a little bit of time right now doing that. I feel like there needs to be Jeopardy music or something going in the background. So when people are feeling like they've had a chance to go through a couple of those, you have a list, you've written some things down, just give me a little thumbs up so I can get a sense for how people are doing. Or type something in the chat so that I know. Okay, we're about half folks have moved on here. So I'd like to have a little conversation. So what was that? Did anybody see any themes? Did anybody see any trends that came out? And you can unmute and share right now if you want, or you can type it into the chat. I'd just like to know how that was for folks, if they actually felt like they were surprised by anything that they learned, or if they saw some themes emerge. Would anybody like to share? That's okay. All right. Well, we'll have a time for questions. So this is one of those things that I think is really important for you to start thinking about, is stepping away from what are the job titles that I could do and moving to a place of what are the types of activities that I want to do for a job. So I'm going to encourage you to keep thinking about this, especially when we get to some of the other activities that you can do for homework and trying to identify this. And even if you feel like you have a good idea of what it is you want to do, pay attention to those things. What about that job do you really like? One of the things I will point out is that for a lot of people who think that they want to have a tenure track career, I think this happens to a lot of faculty. They want to have a tenure track career because they really love science, and then they start doing that job and they realize it's not as exciting as they thought. It's a lot of personnel management. It's a lot of budget management. It's a lot of grant writing. It's things that they weren't really planning to do, right? That's not what brought them into it. And if you can pay attention to what you like doing, that sets you up for these options that will actually be better aligned with your interests. I will say from my own personal experience, during my PhD and during my postdoc, I didn't think about what I wanted to do. I just thought I was going to be a faculty member because that's what you're supposed to do. Had I stopped to think about it, I would have realized that the kinds of things that I really get enjoyment from, that I get reward and satisfaction from, are much better aligned with the kind of work that I do now, right? I like helping other people solve their problems. I like making more immediate change. I'm not driven by this, desire to find this answer to this one question that's eating me up inside, right? So again, paying attention to those can be really important. So Elizabeth shared themes were need a PhD in infused experience, balance of wet lab and planning, designing, emphasis on planning, focus on disease research. So that's great, right? Because planning is a theme that comes up. So you can start to pay attention to that as you go through your training. All right. So as we move into this next phase, I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about how do you deal with some of the stress and some of the anxiety and some of the worry that can associate this. So I'm with making transitions. So I would like to know, when you think about your career transition process right now, what's one word that comes to mind about how you feel about that process? Turbulent, I like that one. No, it goes with the turbulence. Nervous, worried, overwhelmed, daunting. Yeah. Overwhelmed is coming up. Yeah. And I think that for anyone who is making a transition or thinking about a transition right now, there's a little bit more worry than normal, right? Uncertainty is one of the worst kinds of stresses that we can have. And there's a tremendous amount of uncertainty right now. And this is why this next piece that we're going to talk about is so important, right? when you think about career transitions, when you think about anything you're trying to accomplish, when there are all of these strong emotions, when there's a lot of worry, when there's a lot of anxiety and stress, it's difficult to find a plan. It's difficult to figure out how do you move forward. It's difficult to manage all of those tasks. In addition to making career transitions and thinking about what you want to do, you also all have full-time responsibilities, right? So it's difficult right now. It's a hard time to be making transitions. It's a hard time to think about it. And so paying attention to the stress that's associated with this becomes really important. But there's good news here, okay? This is what having a PhD does, right? You're all problem solvers. So when you think about these career transitions and when you think about the stress of it, it's getting started that can be the difficult part. But again, you have these skills. These are things that you do every day when you're in the laboratory. It's how do you actually harness that, and how do you take advantage of those skill sets, and how do you help move yourself forward? That getting some structure around it becomes important. And you don't need to do this alone. This is going to be one of those most important messages for this. So one of the things that I like to talk about when we think about careers and career transitions is resiliency. And so you probably have talked about resiliency in other contexts, but here, this is really what where resiliency becomes important. So resilience has been defined by Sharon Milgram, who's the director of the Office for Intramural Training and Education at the NIH, as this equation of people plus process. So there are people that you can, who are there, who can help you, and there are resources that are available for you to take advantage of. People who are resilient prepare to be resilient. So having a plan, how are you actually going to set yourself up to make different transitions? Who are the people that you can involve, and what are the resources at your disposal? To be resilient, we have to learn from our experiences, both good and bad, right? So this is where the career exploration piece, in this process, you're going to find out that things you thought you were interested in don't interest you. You're going to find out that there are careers that you were considering that just don't seem like a good option anymore. That's just as valuable as figuring out what is good. Building strong, positive professional relationships becomes important. And so this is an area where it's both having a peer network, but then a network of professionals that are at stages beyond where you're at. Ultimately, this is about you and your careers. I don't feel like we have those conversations enough with postdocs and students, that this is your choice, right? It's not, the goal is not to become your mentor unless that's what you want to do. It is your choice to decide what you want to do, but you have to take ownership of that career. You have to take advantage of these resources that are there. And then developing a growth mindset, right? Which is that I can learn things if I try. You're not good at something or bad at something. You have experience with something or you don't. But if you apply yourself, you will be able to learn. So I just want to have a little conversation about resiliency, because again, the more that you apply these strategies, the better positioned you're going to be for career transitions now and in the future. All right. So how do you actually go into this? How do you approach this? So using that scientific mindset, exploring your career scientifically. So here's where we have this simple process that we can apply. So it's thinking about, again, what are you interested in? Having that self-awareness, identifying careers that allow you to do those things. One of the most important things you can do for your career is conducting informational interviews. And so that's talking with people who are doing those jobs now. And then finally, testing it out a little bit. At the end of that process, you'll be positioned to reflect on that and say, here's what I know that I like doing. I thought this thing would let me do that. This is what people say about it. This was my experience with it. Did I really like that? Okay, let's dive into these a little bit more. So self-awareness, again, we talked about what do you like doing? What do you find most rewarding in your current work? So one of the ways to do this is to keep a career journal. So write down, keep a log. What did you like doing in the lab? What did you enjoy doing this week? When you get home from work and you're really excited or invigorated, what happened during that day? The same way, you know, one of those days when you're like, I don't ever want to do that again, right? But paying attention to that and keeping a log of it, and then reflect after a couple weeks or a month. And you'll start to see these patterns. Every day that I was really excited by work was a day that I got to present something. It was either a departmental seminar, I led a lab meeting, right? Talking about science is what invigorated you. Another way to do it is the personality assessment. So I recommended taking the AAAS My IDP. That's a great place to start if you haven't done it. You don't have to do the full IDP, but the inventory in the beginning, which is a skills, values, and interests inventory, will help you have an understanding of here's stuff that I like. Other things to think about, though, are the Clifton Strengths Finders. So we do a workshop on understanding your own unique personality talents. And so that'll be something we offer later this semester. But this is a way to get in touch with what are those unique things that you like doing. This is not about the skills that you have. This is about who you are as a person. But when you can identify careers that allow you to utilize your own personality strengths, you're going to be more rewarded in that career. So again, start paying attention to what do you like doing and what do you enjoy right now about your work is an indication of what you could enjoy next. Once you have an idea of that, and this comes back to where we talked about teaching careers, and if you've identified that you enjoy teaching, what are the careers that allow you to do that kind of thing? Whatever those are, if it's data analysis, if it's planning like we talked about, project management, communication, those are careers that will allow you to do those things. Again, when you can reframe the options presented to PhDs, rather than, oh my God, there's so many choices, when you focus it on, there are so many choices that I can do whatever I want to do, you just have to figure out what do you want to do. I make that sound like that's really easy. That's not that easy. But so then you identify what are some of those careers, right? Aside from titles, what are the sectors? I have talked to postdocs who thought they were interested in consulting. They did a little bit of that work and they realized that they didn't like the for-profit nature of it. They didn't like how it felt a little salesy for stuff. They identified that their values were really more aligned with a university setting. And so then that shifted the types of sectors that they were looking for careers. So you can do this by using keywords, right? So if it's science communication, if it is project management, if it is assay development, whatever it is that you find you like doing, use those as keywords rather than job titles. You're not looking for scientist one. You're looking for anything that involves assay development. See what gets presented to you then. You can use search engines like Indeed. I'll recommend LinkedIn. I think LinkedIn is, again, going to be one of the best tools at your disposal for a lot of the things that you're going to do here. Other things you can do is that you can go to career seminars. So this happens at departmental levels. This happens at conferences. This happens through things my office does. So there are going to be people who are there talking about their careers. This is a great way to just kind of passively attend. And it may be that the career doesn't sound that interesting to you, but if you go to that, you may be surprised by what you learn. So this is, panel discussions that may be put on with alumni. There are a lot of times when there are going to be people who are talking about the kinds of careers that they have, where you can just sit and consume some of that information. You can talk with each other, right? As we did with that first slide, everybody has they have some idea of what they want to do. What didn't show up on that list was I have no idea, right? I'm sure there's some people who are very unsure, but everybody has some kind of idea about what they want to do. When you talk to each other, you start to see, oh, well, why are you interested in medical writing? I'd never heard of that before. What does that really entail, right? You're a wealth of knowledge and you can share those experiences with each other. So these are all ways that you can start to identify what some of these potential options are. Once you have an idea of what those jobs are, now you want to learn what it's really like. And you can get this information by talking to people who are doing those jobs. What I will say about informational interviewing is that the people who created the AAAS My IDP have subsequently done follow-up studies with trainees to identify what was really helpful for them making their career transitions. And lo and behold, it wasn't having an individual development plan. The most important thing for people's ability to identify a career and make a transition was conducting an informational interview. So an informational interview is just like asking for directions. We do a workshop on this that'll go into more detail about how do you conduct these, how do you set these up. But informational interviewing is one of those tools at your disposal, one of those resources where you can contact somebody who's doing the kind of job you think you're interested in and have a conversation with them about how did they make that choice? What do they find most rewarding? What do they like least about it? What was surprising? What advice would they give to somebody looking to transition? Right? So it's a great way to get information about the career. The other thing that's so critical, though, is that it allows you to start building your professional network and making connections with people who at some point can say, oh, I just talked to Lauren about this and this position came up. I'm going to forward it along to her. Or a year later, when you're applying for a position at that company, you know somebody and you contact them. You say, hey, it was great talking with you. I really appreciated that. I'm actually applying for this position now. Do you know who the hiring manager is so I can address my cover letter personally? Right? So you have this opportunity to start building your professional network without approaching people and saying, hey, do you know of any jobs, right? You don't do that with an informational interview. So you want to be prepared. You want to know what you're interested in. You want to know why you think you're interested in that kind of career. This is also going to be an opportunity for you to talk about yourself. This is what LinkedIn is for, right? So if you're looking for where do you find people to do informational interviews, this is what happens on LinkedIn. So now you've identified these positions, you know these are the job titles that you want. And so then you just do a search on LinkedIn to identify who are people that are doing these careers. And you can reach out to them, make a connection request, send them the personalized message. But this is an opportunity to use LinkedIn to build your professional network and conduct informational interviews. Finding alumni, right? That's another great resource. They not only were where you're at right now in terms of a training stage, they were physically located where you're at, right? They know what it's like to be at Anschutz. They know what those challenges are. So you can talk to a lot of alumni. Now, I'm a great person to ask if you're looking for somebody who was a trainee that's now doing something else. I may be able to connect you, but you also all know people and your mentors know people, right? So find some alumni and reach out to them to do informational interviews. Okay. Once you now know, right, you've had this idea, here's what I think I want to do, here's what I'm interested in, here are people that are doing it, I've been talking to them, it sounds great. Now you got to try it out yourself, okay? Is that really the kind of thing that you want to do? So when I was making my career transition, I had applied for faculty positions, I did not get faculty positions, I was thrown into the turbulent time of not knowing, not having a plan, uncertain what's coming next. I thought I was interested in writing. Like I've always enjoyed writing. I did some freelance scientific editing and I did some contract medical writing. And had I not done this ahead of time, I would have said, oh yeah, that's the career for me. I'm going to buy a tweed jacket, leather patches on the elbows, start smoking a pipe. I'm going to be a writer. But when I actually started doing some of that work, I realized it wasn't nearly as stimulating as I thought it was going to be. And now this is the type of medical writing I was doing, right? But it was very monotonous, very rote. It wasn't the kind of thing that I enjoyed. So it wasn't what I thought it was going to be. And I only found that out by actually doing it. Editing was great, but you make like 6 cents an hour. And that wasn't the kind of thing I could do for a career. I also realized I'm way too meticulous of a person to go into that career and have any kind of speed for it. Those are things that I only learned by trying it out, okay? Before you get to that step, there are some things that you can try with online job simulations. So there's a website called intersectjobs.com where you can try out a lot of different activities. So they have samples of what work is like in different places. That's a pretty low stakes way to start seeing what some of these careers are actually like. You can shadow, right? Now that you know people and you've made these connections through your informational interviewing, say, hey, could I follow you around for a day? And I understand that right now is not the time to be asking people to follow them around. But maybe they have other ideas. Like, yeah, you know, we could, I'd happy to share some project work with you so you can see what it's like. So you can see what a day in my life is like, right? During non-COVID times, when we get back to it, shadowing is a great way to learn more about what that environment is really like. There are internships that you can do. So CU Innovations, for anybody who's interested in tech transfer, entrepreneurship, intellectual property, they actually have a fellowship that is for market analysis. So if you want to know how the commercialization process works, there's an internship that you can participate in. It's a paid, they call it a fellowship. It's a paid fellowship, but basically they will give you projects to do some market analysis on actual IP that they're considering, right? So that's a great way to add that in. But there are a lot of places that will have opportunities to do this that won't advertise it. And so you can ask people when you do informational interviews, hey, this would be great. Do you know of any internship opportunities at your company? Or you can do freelance contract work. That's some of that stuff that I did, right? So on the side of the work that I was doing, I actually tested some of this out. So it's a nice thing because it will add to your experience, but then it also, you can get paid for it. So that's helpful as well. And at the end of this, right, so now you have the self-awareness, you know this is the stuff you're interested in, you've found these jobs, you've talked to people doing it, you tested it out, now you reevaluate, right? This is that scientific process. This is what you do all the time in the lab, right? You have an idea, you have your hypothesis, you test it out, you look at those results, You figure out, did that confirm? Did we reject it? Let's revisit. What are we going to do? How do we reformulate this, right? So again, just apply that same process to your career. You have this skill set, right? It's not just in the lab that it's useful. You can apply it here. So this is the second part of the worksheet that we have. And I'm going to encourage you to actually take some time to fill it out, to think about, of those things we talked about, the self-awareness, doing AAA SMI-IDP, or doing informational interviews, which of those can you actually employ to learn more about the different careers that you have? So treat it like a grant proposal, right? There are things you already know. There are things you know you're interested in. You know some of these options. You went and you found job postings. You found things that appeal to you. So what do you like doing? Who are people that can help you in this process? So who are people who are going to give you guidance along the way? Who's a co-investigator? Who's a peer that'll go through this process with you to help you identify careers? We know, again, getting to some of the stress, the worry, the anxiety, all of that stuff gets easier when we feel like we have a support network. So who are some people that can help you in this process? You have this simple research question, right? What kind of job do you want? So you can formulate a hypothesis. I think that this is the kind of career for me, right? That becomes testable. So how are you going to test it? Like I was just saying, which of those activities that we talked about are you going to actually apply in the process of exploring these different careers? Remember to check potential pitfalls, right? So this is where I mentioned like teaching careers at universities. Oftentimes those are just as competitive and they don't pay as well. If you're interested in a tenure track position, are you willing to chase that around the country? This is one of those challenges when I was applying for positions. I was looking for jobs in Denver, Colorado, or Madison, Wisconsin. I wanted to live in those two locations. To be able to call your shot like that, you have to be really special. And by special, I mean you have to have money. You have to have some grant funding that you're bringing with you. And even then, it's difficult. My postdoc advisor would always remind me of how he ended up in Denver. And he ended up in Denver because that's where he got the job. And he applied all over. So is that something you're willing to do? Is that something you want to do? Do you want to live in a certain location? Those all become really important factors too. And then in the end of that, what are your conclusions? And you iterate on the process and you try it again. Okay? So you have the skill set to do this. The problem oftentimes is getting started. And so I hope that you'll actually think about these careers and what are some of these opportunities you have to start building your exploration plan. Okay, this is where the homework comes in. So this is something we're not going to do during the workshop. I do encourage you to actually fill this out. We know scientifically that when people create a written plan, they're more likely to follow through on it. We know that if you can identify someone who would be a co-investigator to do this process with you, whether that's a fellow student or postdoc, or it's a student and a postdoc, whatever it is, we are more accountable when someone else agrees to do something with us. These are things that happen with like exercise plans. People know that they're more likely to adhere to that if they have a workout buddy. So who's your exploration partner for this? I would absolutely encourage you to think about that. These are concrete strategies that you can apply to get you started. If you do nothing else, starting to conduct informational interviews is one of the best possible things that you can be doing right now to figure out if this is the kind of career you're interested in and to set you up for making transitions in the future. Again, these are just experiments, right? You know how to do it. So lay them out, design them, and then start conducting them. Okay. So I wanted to make sure that we had time for questions. So I'm going to open it up at the end of the workshop here to take questions. If you feel like you are not interested in hanging out for questions, I would ask you to please remember to do the workshop evaluation before you leave. But again, this is time that I wanted to make sure we had to address anything that came up in the workshop or other career questions that you have right now. And so we can either share those in the chat or you can unmute yourself and ask them directly. And if you would like to ask a question anonymously, you can just send that to me. If you want to pose a question to everybody, you can share it that way as well. This is always hard because I'm not sure if people are asking questions, but I think a lot of people may be typing stuff. So I will try to be patient.
I'll ask a question verbally because it'll be a bit lengthy to type out. So we talked a lot about the career title, and maybe that's not right for you about what you thought was right. But what about if you started down this path and you just think the entire field that you're in is wrong? What sorts of options are available for transitions in that regard?
Yeah. So is the question about mid-degree? So like if you're in a field of study, or is it about post-degree? That's my first clarification.
Both?
Both. Okay. So what I will say is that there are always options. So when you get in touch with the things that you're interested in, there are always going to be viable options for you. Whether that those options will be different depending on the degree that you ultimately have. I think for people who have a PhD, there's no limit on the kinds of things that you want to do or that you can do, that you become qualified for. A lot of that holds true if you have a master's degree. The change can depend on how far you will ascend within those positions. So there are certain positions that will require having that terminal degree. So one of the things that I will say too is that I actually do individual career coaching. And if you have questions about your specific scenario, shoot me an email and let's find a time to talk about that. If you recognize that the whole field you're in is something that doesn't interest you, then it's probably time to look at what are those other things that you could do. One of the things I will say is that sometimes that gets tied to the discipline and not the activities. And so I found that when I took this position, I decided I didn't want to, I didn't like writing grants. I didn't want to do that stuff. The reality was that I didn't like writing behavioral pharmacology grants submitted to the National Institute on Drug Abuse. But I actually really like the process of coming up with ideas for grants and grant writing. So it wasn't that I didn't like that thing. It's that I didn't like that thing in that particular context. And I bet there are pieces of that even in a situation where you don't like the field, there are aspects that you do like. But we can find a time to talk more specifically about those individual situations. But there are always more options than you think. And those options start to get presented when you start talking to people. I hope that got to it a bit. So a question came in, how early do you recommend looking for your next position? I've heard for a faculty position, a year in advance is appropriate. Yeah, faculty positions are interesting, right? Because they're usually tied to specific hiring cycles. And so there are going to be certain times during the year. I think the biggest thing, so more time, I would recommend as soon as you feel like you are at a point where you're ready to conclude your training and you feel like you are going to be competitive on the market, that's the time to start looking. Now, some of that is difficult to figure out without talking to people. Faculty positions become more prescriptive. So if you are looking for an R1 level tenure track position, then you want to be able to demonstrate that you have some history of funding. So you had an F32, you had a K99, you had some other K award, you have something there because the people that you're going to be applying against are also going to have that funding. If you wanted to apply for a faculty position that required significant undergraduate teaching and you've never done that, you're likely not going to be competitive for that position. So in having these conversations with people, that's some of that information you want to figure out. What are those things that you need to be competitive? Once you feel like you're actually at that point, though, it's never too early to start applying because it's going to be a much longer, more drawn-out process. So absolutely, if it's a year ahead of time, faculty positions also are easier than other positions oftentimes because they won't have you start usually until the fall semester or something like that. So you have time to wrap things up. This gets a little bit more dicey if you're applying for an industry position that may want to hire much more quickly than that. I think the more time you have, the better. So as soon as you feel like you are at a place where you're going to start being competitive for these positions, I would say start applying for them. Suggestions for an international student looking for a job in the USA. Yeah, so that's going to be another layer of challenge and issue. Some of it will depend on your current visa situation, and then identifying companies that may be willing to sponsor some other forms of visa. So again, those are very specific kinds of questions. So in terms of general suggestions, I would say start talking to people. In particular, start talking to other international scientists who have transitioned to positions in the US and building out that aspect of your network. Again, informational interviewing is a great way to start building these relationships and getting this specific guidance and advice from people.
Hey, Bruce?
Yeah.
Speaking of informational interviews, do we just try to set them up ourselves through like networking, or is that like how common is it? Like, how do you go about even getting an informational interview?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so that's one of those things that we'll tackle more in depth in the informational interviewing workshop. For this, what I'll say is they're very common. In most industries, people are familiar with that terminology. People have been doing informational interviews long before we started calling them that. And now it's very commonplace to refer to them as an informational interview. So, and it doesn't have to be weird, right? Like, so you find somebody on LinkedIn that you would want to talk to. You don't have to say, dear Dr. So-and-so, I'd like to conduct an informational interview with you. It's, would you have 30 minutes sometime in the next 2 weeks when I could ask you some questions about your career? Right? So we use it as a term to kind of describe what it is. But when you would ask somebody for one, it's really just saying, hey, would you chat with me about what you're doing now? And for a lot of folks, there's some anxiety about making that cold call. But when you step back for a second, what you're saying is, hey, I think what you're doing is really cool. So cool, in fact, I might want to do that for my career. Would you tell me about yourself? So it's a flattering request. The worst thing that will happen, right? Because like some of those thoughts that go through people's heads are, I'm not going to ask the CEO of Pfizer if they'll sit down and chat with me because they're going to think, who the hell am I, or whatever, that kind of stuff. The reality is that the worst that's going to happen is they just won't reply. They're just not going to answer you, right? It's not that they're going to think anything negative of you or anything like that, right? So again, it's one of those things that can produce a little worry, a little stress, a little anxiety, but it's very common. You're asking somebody just to talk about what they do, which is a flattering request. And so there's really nothing to worry about with it. I mean, it's not, yeah, it's worry that you can confront. And it would just be asking them that question. So there's more material and more information on how do you set up informational interviews and how do you make those requests and things like that we do in the other workshop. But I will say it's a very common practice.
So hold on, quick follow-up. How do we get to the other workshop? Like, when are you doing the informational interview workshop?
Yeah, so that should be the next one, and we're going to do it in mid-September, I believe. I haven't, it's not on the calendar quite yet, but it'll be same kind of thing. There's other information on the Career Development Office website. There are prior presentations for that workshop, as well as some other materials for things. So if you wanted some information right now for that. But again, the biggest thing with an informational interview is being prepared and knowing what kind of questions do you have for this person. Because what you don't want to do is set up an informational interview and then just have it be an awkward, silent, and you're wasting this person's time, right? So you just want to be prepared, because there are some other things that can happen with it where you will have an opportunity to market yourself a little bit. So you can talk about, here's your areas of expertise, here's the kind of stuff you're interested in, here's what you would bring to a position, because they're going to ask you a question like, tell me a little bit about yourself. And so this is an opportunity for you to sell that a little bit too. So being prepared in that way really allows you to maximize that tool. Okay. Any other questions? Okay. Well, thank you all for sticking around. I will say again, I would really appreciate your feedback on the post-workshop evaluation. I am available if there are things that we talked about now, because again, one of the hardest things is actually, it's one thing when we sit and we talk about this stuff, it's something else to do it. And so if you start this process and you're like, you know what, that just isn't making sense, or I'm still stuck, or I don't know where to go, I don't know how to get this going, I'm happy to sit down and talk with you about your specific careers that you're interested in, as well as having suggestions for people that you can talk to. Again, we have postdocs and students that have now gone off and are working in every career imaginable. There's a postdoc who is a health security advisor at the State Department right now, responsible for coordinating COVID responses for the whole government. That to people that are working at Children's Hospital, freelance medical writers, people that have started their own companies, it's really all over the map. And so if you're looking for people to start that process, I'm happy to help with some of that too. So if you ever have questions about this or you want to talk more detail, just send me an email and we can set up a time to do that.